Today, Bitcoin and Ether continue to drop. Crypto exchange KuCoin reaches a settlement with New York State authorities, and Muneeb Ali, the CEO of Trust Machines, breaks down what to expect for the Bitcoin network in 2024. Welcome to CNBC's Crypto World. I'm Talia Kaplan. The rout continues for major cryptocurrencies. By noon Eastern, Bitcoin and Ether both dropped more than 1%, with Bitcoin trading around $41,300 and Ether trading close to $2,200. Polygon's Matic token, however, climbed more than 2%. Now, if we pivot over to Wall Street, major crypto-linked stocks were pulled down by this week's sell-off. If you look at MicroStrategy, Coinbase, Riot, and Marathon at 1 p.m. Eastern, they were all down between 6 and 13% this week. That comes amid a broader rally where all these stocks have risen by double digits since the beginning of December. Okay, let's talk about the top stories. KuCoin just reached a settlement with New York State authorities. The crypto exchange agreed to pay $5.3 million to the New York Attorney General. It will also shut down operations in the state, close accounts tied to New York residents, and pay back around $16.8 million in holdings to those customers. Now, these payouts will help the exchange settle allegations that it flouted securities laws by offering Ether, Luna, Terra, and more without registering. Next, the IRS wants FTX to pay $24 billion in unpaid taxes, and the exchange claims that money would come from one source: victims. In a recent filing, FTX asked the court to deny the agency's demand, which originally stood at $43 billion before being revised down. The filing claims the IRS doesn't have a basis for its claim, and that the liability would prevent most of FTX creditors, themselves victims of fraud, from obtaining any meaningful recovery. The filing also argues that in the company's 3 years of operation, it never earned enough to support the IRS's tax claim and instead incurred losses in the billions. Last, CFTC Chair Rostin Behnam joined Squawk Box this morning, where he discussed the latest in crypto regulation and explained the distinction between how he and SEC Chair Gary Gensler think about digital assets.
It's a matter of what is the investor, what is the buyer of the tokens getting with its purchase of a token, whether it's Bitcoin, Ether, or anything else. And I've said this very clearly. I've said it many times. I stick to what we have as the legal precedent and what we're seeing on our markets. And under existing law, many of the tokens constitute commodities. And under this rubric, there is a gap in regulation, and I need Congress to step in.
Now, Behnam said he and Gensler get along quite well and have shared values and interests focused on protecting markets and customers. He also discussed the fate of Binance founder Changpeng Zhao and said CZ will be going to jail. You can check out his full interview over at CNBC.com. All right, for our main story, Crypto World's Jordan Smith spoke with Muneeb Ali, the CEO of Trust Machines, about how developers have changed to Bitcoin in 2023 and what to expect for the world's largest cryptocurrencies network in 2024.
When you spoke to my colleague Tanea McKeel in early summer, you spoke about adoption and where things sort of stood in the midst of the so-called crypto winter. And at the time, you made the point that Bitcoin hasn't really gone mainstream yet, not until it reaches, a few 100 million active users. You called that the next big step for the network. Here we are about 6 months away from that conversation, and we haven't reached that level of adoption per se, but where do things stand in terms of making progress in that regard, especially as we see trading activity pick back up for Bitcoin?
Yes. So I think we've seen Bitcoin go through these growth cycles, right? Like every 4 years, there's a growth cycle. A lot of new users get to learn about Bitcoin. They get attracted to it and so on. So I do think that this time around, we might be at a pretty interesting stage of the growth cycle, where if you cross 100 million, 200 million active users, that actually takes you mainstream. Right? And I don't think Bitcoin's mainstream yet, but it's growing like most technologies do. If you look at cell phones in early 2008, 2009, 2010, Bitcoin is actually following a pretty similar growth trajectory. The interesting thing here is that with Bitcoin's growth, there's always this price. And I think in some ways, when the price goes up, more people get intrigued. They want to sort of learn more about it. And with the ETFs, there are two things that are happening. One is obviously the institutional capital that cannot directly invest in Bitcoin for various reasons. And I think they're sort of been waiting on the sidelines for a while. It's just much easier for them to participate through an ETF. That's the obvious thing, I would say. But I think there's a second thing, which is that there are a lot of financial institutions that have been watching Bitcoin, they've been on the sidelines, They're a little bit scared. They don't really know should they go in or not, because it's a sort of a reputational risk for them. And once they see the BlackRocks of the world who are moving ahead with their ETF, it just makes like their job a lot easier. And I think these other financial institutions can come in and they become the gateway to the next wave of users as well.
When you look at Bitcoin and sort of the selling point for adoption, I think if you look at 2021 and the beginning of 2022, it was really FOMO. Like people were buying in because they were so focused on the price, as you mentioned. But has the narrative of maybe what's most attractive for Bitcoin changed this year? What's the selling point to get people to buy in, especially to reach that idea of it going mainstream?
Yes, I think with Bitcoin, one thing I've seen is that the narrative or the story behind it is becoming sharper, is becoming cleaner. Like people are getting better at telling that story. Like 10 years ago when I started, I think people would describe Bitcoin as like so many different things, and over time it has sharpened. Now, when I'm trying to educate some new person about Bitcoin, I just directly go to inflation. Like that is something that people are actually feeling in their everyday lives. If you ask them that, do you think your grocery bills are going up? And they go like, oh my God, yes, they are. And then you instantly connect with someone right there. And then you start explaining what a fixed asset is and, what inflation is and how it's almost like a hidden tax on you that you don't even notice. And people just have that aha moment. And the analogy with gold actually works really well, that this is digital gold. It's a store of value. Whereas I believe that, of course, Bitcoin can do so many other things as well. Like it can be used for payments, especially with Bitcoin L2s that we will need for getting into like hundreds of millions of users. But sometimes like you don't even go there initially, right? You let people understand the fundamentals and then they go like, oh, it's open source technology. It's actually better rails for the planet and it can do a lot of good around the world. I think, but you need to walk them like step by step. And I would always start with inflation and the fact that it's a hard asset.
Yeah, you just mentioned that the idea and the focus of Bitcoin is becoming sharper, but I want to expand that a little bit and say from a developer perspective, but how has the network advanced this year? You mentioned L2s as an option. This notion that crypto winter is the time to build. You've had some use cases pop up for Bitcoin in 2023, like ordinals. But what would you say was the biggest advancement or the biggest expansion of use case for Bitcoin for the network this year?
Yeah, I think there has definitely been this culture in the industry that whenever a bear market hits, prices go down, a lot of people who were sort of like mercenaries chasing money, they sort of disappear, and the really mission-driven people are left. I think there is this culture that you go back to building. Like this is the time. I really look at this as growth phase, right? Like you saw one phase of growth that actually gave you some real data about where the pain points are, like where the infrastructure needs to improve. And then almost like you get a break. And it's a very welcome break, like personally for me and my team, that now you get to focus on upgrading the infrastructure, upgrading the UX of various things like wallets and so on. And we've used that because I think last time around, there was clear data that Bitcoin cannot really scale. This I'm talking about 2017. And we saw efforts like Lightning, the Stacks project that I co-founded started then. And now with the last cycle, there was even like more clear data that what do users want and so on. But this time around, I think there was something happening where a lot of new applications and NFTs and stablecoins were actually happening on other networks. And we have always had this sort of like vision that all of these successful experiments from crypto would eventually come to Bitcoin in a more mature manner, because Bitcoin is the better asset, right? It's the more secure network. And then 2023, that theory sort of like turned into reality, right? We started seeing ordinals on Bitcoin L1, Bitcoin gas fees went up a lot. And that just shows demand and usage. Like people actually want Bitcoin. People actually want to do interesting things with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin usage can be high enough that it can sustain the security of Bitcoin over the long term as well. And I think that's where Bitcoin L2s become extremely important. Like this is me looking into the future a little bit. Like we're already seeing that the L1 is getting congested. So the L2s are almost like you see a highway that's getting congested and you start building like new highways next to it, expecting demand, expecting users will come. They would want cheaper, faster ways to use their Bitcoin. And I think that's likely going to happen on Bitcoin L2s.
I want to end by talking about your outlook for 2024, not about price, but for the network itself. What are your expectations for next year in terms of adoption or pace of development? What should people be watching for Bitcoin?
Yes, I think the thing that I'm probably the most excited about is that the builder culture is getting a lot better. Like 2 years ago, I think there were smaller pockets like the Stacks project or Lightning and like some small subset areas where you would see developer traction. But the bulk of the industry was actually focused somewhere else. And I've actually seen that trend shift where a lot of well-established companies like Magic Eden and others, they're coming to Bitcoin, but also new developers. When they enter the industry, it's an expanding industry right now. They look at the options. Should I go build on Solana? Should I go build on Ethereum? Should I come to Bitcoin? I think, frankly, Bitcoin was not even an option 2 years ago. Like, as I said, very small pockets of developers with Stacks and Lightning. But now it's a very serious option. Like, people are looking at it. So I think in 2024, I would like to see Bitcoin sort of like emerge as a very serious player for applications. I would love to see stable coins on Bitcoin, like lending protocols take off directly on Bitcoin with BTC as the asset. I think if BTC is the pristine asset, people want to own it. They don't want to sell it, but they would love to take a loan against that for some liquidity without seeing the counterparty risk that we saw with BlockFi and all of the other players from the last cycle. So I think for me, 2024 sort of means that decentralized technology, decentralized applications, things like DEXs, they start coming to Bitcoin in a meaningful way, and we start seeing a ton of volume and a ton of users there.
Okay, that's all for Crypto World today, but we'll be back again tomorrow, and we'll see you then.